They made me wait for an hour outside the review room, a thin corridor, thick with the scent of old varnish and schoolbooks, glassy-eyed portraits of dead composers watching my shoes scuff the floor. The door rattled with the nervous coughs of the professors inside. I remember wishing I had brought my sketchbook or even a toothpick, just something to hold in my hands. Instead, my fingers roamed their own anxious path. Tracing the veins on the wood banister, tapping some obscure rhythm on the tile, I felt every sound, every draft from the cracked window above. The heat was stifling, but sweat sat cold under my arms. When the door finally opened, Professor Orbit emerged and summoned me with a clipped M. Petty. Inside, the committee sat behind a heavy table, 5 of them, faces blank but for a few raised eyebrows. My violin lay on the velvet cloth in the center, just where I'd left it. Beside it, my sketches, every angle painstakingly drawn, annotated with measurements down to the half millimeter. I stood straight, reciting in my head all the reasons Stradivari used maple, why I was sure my own curve would give the tone its depth. All I needed was for them to hear it, to see past the stubborn tradition. Instead, they shuffled papers. Professor Dubois cleared her throat like a signal shot. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, monsieur," she began, already glancing at the others. "Yet the jury finds your proposal to be frankly naive. These eccentric lines, the alterations to the F-holes, such experimentations are not practical and certainly not in line with the French school." Orbit nodded, eyes sliding away from mine. "We expect greater fidelity to time-tested models at the école." I pressed my tongue hard against my teeth, tried to swallow the dryness, but why not let it sing first? "You haven't even played it." Professor Bellamy, who had not looked up once, caught my gaze. "We've heard enough, monsieur, already from out in the corridor." For a second I almost laughed. But something inside, the part of me still raw from years of carrying my father's tools in his cramped shop, rose like bile. In my mind, I saw 100 nights spent whittling spruce by candlelight, my hands blistered and stained with glue. Rage flickered under my skin, but I kept my jaw locked. "Thank you for your time," I said, voice tight. Outside, I collected my instrument. My palms shook so badly I barely managed the latch on the case. The corridor seemed longer now, lined with the ghosts of every student who'd surrendered to their judgments. When I told my parents I'd failed, my father barely glanced up from his paper. He simply let out a grunt, folded another page, and said, "No one makes a living with those toys." My mother, kneading dough in the kitchen, turned her lips down. "You're clever with your hands, Luke," she offered quietly. "There's work at the carpentry. M. Rousseau takes apprentices." I stared at her, feeling suddenly very young. My sister Leia, 12 and merciless, barked, "Just because you play at being a genius doesn't mean you are one." I wanted to throw something, but instead I grabbed my violin case and left. On the stairs, the old landlady eyed me as if expecting me to fail too. It wasn't that I thought I'd be famous, but as the days stretched into months, the laughter in our neighborhood darkened. On the corner by the bakery, the boys smirked when I walked by, humming a half-mocking waltz. In church, Madame Gerard asked if I'd finally grown out of my little project. Each jab felt like a sliver, settling deeper just beneath the surface. My dreams shrank into corners. I worked odd jobs, saved every sou, and spent the nights tinkering at a rickety desk in my attic room. But even as anger simmered inside me, restraint kept my hands at the work. Rage can lead one to snap. Restraint will build a bridge from scrap. At 24, I left Montmartre with little more than a battered valise and the violin. Paris was not forgiving. It devoured men like me and spat us out sleepless. I stayed in a drafty pension on the Rue Oberkampf, where the wallpaper peeled in strips and the ceiling held secrets from the neighbors above. I found work at Thibault's atelier, a cramped back room behind a music shop. Old Monsieur Thibault was nearly blind, his hands twisted with arthritis, but his memory for wood astonished me. He let me work the scraps, sharpening my eye for burl and resonance. Some days he'd glance over my shoulder with a grunt, then murmur, "Your lines always so bold, boy." I ate plain bread, cheap cheese, and sometimes nothing but hope for supper. I listened to the musicians who came and went, their laughter filling gaps in my own silent evenings. My friends from school faded to memories. My family's letters became rare, tinged with worry or disappointment. And still, late at night, I carved. Years ticked past, each day marked by little victories, an apprenticeship completed, a commission fulfilled from a conservatory student, the first time a local quartet used one of my violas in concert. But I remained obscure. At times I almost believed the committee. Maybe I was naive, an eccentric lost in the romance of failure. Then, in the winter of my 31st year, fate took a sudden turn. A man came into Thibault's shop one afternoon, a foreigner, tall and broad-shouldered in a rumpled navy suit. He spoke little French, but his English rolled richly. His name was Simon Feld, a violinist from New York, and he wanted to commission a new instrument. He ran a finger along the old Italian models in the display case, but his eyes lingered on my sketches, which I'd left stacked on a side stool. "You designed these?" I nodded, unsure how much he understood. "Very different, modern but still, soul, yes," he grinned. "Try make for me something only you dream." "I don't need another old copies." His eyes said more than the words. The world outside had no memory of my old failures. Rage at the old committee flared, but now it burned cold and white, a focused light. I worked for months, days blurring into night, the workshop lit by a single bulb and the dull Paris dawns. The process nearly broke me, mistakes sanded out, splinters dug from bleeding fingers, glue boiled and rebottled late into the evening. But I finished, and when Simon returned, he played the first notes under the shop's low ceiling. The sound soared, richer than even I'd imagined, the overtones gliding like breath itself. Simon took the violin back to America. A year later, he wrote to tell me he'd debuted it at Carnegie Hall. Suddenly, the commissions began to flow. My name appeared in footnotes, then in larger script: Luc Petit, luthier, Paris. I took a humble room near Place de la Bastille, a small atelier all my own. My tools arranged with reverence, the windows facing east so I could catch the first sunlight on fresh shavings. Some days I made violins, others violas or cellos, each with my touch, a little eccentricity, a refusal to accept the flatage of tradition. I traveled to Cremona, Vienna, even London for exhibitions. At each, musicians would flock to my table, running hands along the varnish, asking about the curves, but Paris still haunted me. My parents' disappointment lingered at the edges. Letters home were careful, neutral, visits rare and stiff. Leia, too, stayed distant, although I heard from neighbors she'd started working at a bank, sensible and serious. Once she sent a birthday card but signed only L. Meanwhile, the university, that old committee, never called or wrote. Their rejection remained a wound, less bloody but deep. The year I turned 40, the Paris Gazette ran a feature on modern instrument makers. A journalist visited, snapping photos as I worked, asking questions about wood and finish and the necessity of innovation. My story found its way to more eyes than I'd ever planned. A festival director called, inviting me to judge their annual string competition. "M. Petty, your reputation grows each day." We'd be honored. Nights I lay awake, remembering every smirk, every sneer. Rage finally shrunk to a simmer, tamped down by time but never quite gone. That spring, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the very university that had once dismissed me. They were convening a special instrument exhibition, inviting alumni and local artisans to present their work. I was welcome if I cared to share my craft. For days, I turned their letter over and over, half tempted to toss it on the fire. But I accepted, not out of pettiness, at least that's what I told myself, but to plant a flag where my ghost still wandered. The university hall smelled the same, a bouquet of beeswax polish and old parchment. The faculty, too, looked much as before, though greyer and more stooped, yet their eyes flicked to me with new calculation. I set up my table with a strange calm. Across from me stood luthiers with names I'd read in catalogues, each with gleaming, safe instruments. My own trio sat in a nest of deep blue velvet, a violin, a viola, and my latest cello, each marked with the subtle asymmetry that had once so offended the committee. While I arranged my tools, someone tapped my shoulder. I turned to find Professor Dubois, older and leaner, lips pulled tight. "M. Petty," she said, "we were pleased to see your name. Time has proven your persistence." I met her gaze, feeling a rush of old anger, but I kept my voice mild. "Persistence is all I've ever had, Professor." She nodded and moved on. The doors opened and the crowd flowed in, students, tourists, the city's music elite. I recognized faces from the old neighborhood. My mother, carefully dressed, next to my father in a borrowed suit. Leia with her hair pinned up, dark eyes breaking their gaze from the floor at the first sight of me. Whispers flitted through the room. People paused, curious about the odd-shaped F-holes and the unfamiliar arching. Then the demonstration began. A young violinist, one of the faculty's brightest, was handed my instrument. She turned it over, brow raised at the lines. The room went very quiet. At the first draw of the bow, the sound burst through the hush. It was impossible to mistake, a timbre clear and honeyed, resonant enough to fill the stone arches, yet nimble, light as laughter. She played, notes winding up into the sunbeams that fell between dust motes, and the room seemed to breathe with the music. Suddenly, the skepticism in the room faded, replaced by a kind of hunger. Professors leaned forward, their skepticism giving way to silent calculation. One by one, musicians asked to try the instruments. Each time, the skeptics found themselves entranced by the unfamiliar but powerful resonance. The air in the hall transformed. What had once been mockery now hung as the sharp, metallic scent of envy and quiet awe. At the end, the committee convened, a ritual both ceremonial and redundant now. Orbit, looking much older, approached my father, who stood silent by the door. Petty, he said, you must be proud of your son, his work is quite remarkable. My father's hands, scarred and trembling, fumbled for his hat. He always was, but I did not see it, he admitted quietly. Yet the true moment arrived begrudgingly, like spring after a hard winter. Traversing the room, Leia stopped before my table. For a while she said nothing, fingers moving idly along the velvet. I used to think you were foolish, Luke, chasing ghosts. Now, she smiled thinly, shaking her head in disbelief, I heard how people spoke today. I never thought their mouths could say your name so kindly. I reached across, placing my battered hand over hers. Neither did I said, and for the first time it felt true. Outside, the city glowed, a clamour of bells and laughter, the sky smeared with early evening blue. On the walk home, my family moved beside me, quieter than I remembered but somehow closer. The entire quartier seemed to tilt a little differently, neighbours waving or nodding, pride mixing awkwardly with the memories of all their old jokes. That night in my atelier, I stood over my bench, tools resting in the easy hush. The city outside still bustled, but inside my rage had finally settled, transformed through all those years of restraint into the sweet, ringing voice of something I'd made myself. I lifted the latest violin from its cradle, turning it in the warm lamplight. There, in the delicate curl of the scroll and bold line of the ribs, sat the proof, the memory of every dismissal and every dream, now bound with varnish and song. I drew the bow across the strings, and the note rose clear and true into the Parisian air.